Welcome back. Hello friend, about 85% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you also don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comment. I went camping with my uncle and his best friend deep in the Amazon rainforest. They'd been talking about this trip for years, saying how untouched and beautiful the forest was. I was excited, but also a bit scared. The Amazon was nothing like anything I'd been through before, and I had heard stories about how dangerous it could be. But I trusted my uncle and his friend. They'd been doing this for years. We hiked most of the day, cutting through thick trees and bushes, listening to the buzzing of insects and the calls of animals in the distance. The air felt heavy and sticky, making it harder to walk the farther we went. It was like the deeper we went into the forest, the more the jungle felt like it was closing in on me. By the time we set up camp, the sun was starting to go down. The air cooled a little, but it still felt like the humidity was sticking to my skin. We found a small spot near a stream and put up our tents. My uncle and his friend acted like everything was fine, going about setting up camp like it was no big deal. But I had this weird feeling. It was like we weren't supposed to be there, like something was watching us. Night came fast, and with it came the noise. Birds screeched, leaves rustled, and strange sounds echoed around us from every direction. It freaked me out, but I tried to tell myself it was normal for this place. We were in the middle of the jungle, after all. Of course, the wildlife would be loud. I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric above me, thinking about how thin it was. There was barely anything between me and the jungle outside. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The sounds outside started to feel like they were getting closer, sharper. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch snap like something big was moving out there. My heart started racing, but I kept telling myself it was just in my head. Then the sounds got louder. Footsteps. Not the quick movements of small animals or the rustling of birds. These were heavy, slow, and steady. I froze, trying not to make a sound. My breathing was shallow as I listened. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I heard something soft, like a shuffle, and something brushed against my tent. My mind raced, thinking of all the things it could be. A big animal, maybe. Something curious, maybe just passing through. But it was too quiet. No growling, no noises, just silence. Time seemed to stretch forever, and I kept waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, but this time they were moving away. Slowly, I let out a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. I wanted to look outside, but my body wouldn't move. I couldn't bring myself to check. Morning came, and the air felt even heavier than before. I crawled out of my tent, feeling stiff and drained from the night. My uncle and his friend were already up, looking around the campsite. Something was wrong. The ground near our tents was all messed up, like something big had been moving around. There were huge prints in the dirt, leading toward the forest and back again. They didn't look like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were too big and too deep. We packed up quickly. No one really said anything, but we all knew it was time to go. As we walked through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. I kept looking back, expecting to see something following us, but I never did. We reached the main trail by midday, tired and quiet. The jungle sounds faded behind us as we left, almost like whatever had been there had stopped watching us. I've gone over that night in my head more times than I can count, trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was just a big animal, or maybe it was something else. But the truth is, we were never alone out there. Something was watching us the whole time, and I know if we hadn't left when we did, it would have come back. I've never really liked camping, but my boyfriend talked me into it. He said it would be a good break from my job. I manage a lot of people, always dealing with meetings and deadlines. Camping in the woods was the last thing I thought I'd be doing, but I went along with it. We loaded up the car and drove far out to a campsite deep in the woods, far from the city. The first day was nice enough. We found a spot near a small lake, set up the tent, and walked around for a while. The air was fresh, and it felt good to be away from all the work stress. That evening, we made a fire and cooked dinner. Everything felt calm, and I started to unwind. But once the sun went down, everything changed. The woods got really quiet, that kind of silence that reminds you how far you are from anyone else. No cars, no people, just us. After a while, we got into the tent to sleep. I thought I'd crash right away after such a long day, but every little sound outside kept waking me up. At first, I told myself it was just animals, maybe some twigs snapping or leaves moving in the wind, but something didn't feel right. These weren't random noises. It sounded like something was slowly moving toward us. I lay there, listening carefully. My boyfriend was sound asleep, totally unaware. I didn't want to wake him up over nothing, so I stayed still, telling myself I was just imagining things. Then I felt it. Something heavy pressed against the side of the tent. My heart started pounding. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it through the fabric, right next to me. I held my breath, hoping it would go away, but the pressure didn't stop. It started to move, slowly sliding along the tent, heading toward the entrance. I could hear soft footsteps now, each one careful, like it was trying not to be heard. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe the light would scare it off. I shone it toward the entrance of the tent, but there was nothing there. I tried to calm myself down, thinking it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something harmless. But as soon as I started to relax, I heard something else. This time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the tent, breathing, but it wasn't mine or my boyfriend's. This was heavier, slower, like someone was crouched in the corner, right there in the dark, just out of view. I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how this could be possible. The tent was zipped up, and we were the only ones in it. There was no way anyone could have gotten in without us noticing. I wanted to turn and check, but I was frozen, lying there with my eyes wide open, staring at the roof of the tent. I was hoping, praying, that whatever it was would just go away. Then, all of a sudden, the breathing stopped. I stayed perfectly still, waiting, not knowing what would happen next. Seconds passed, then minutes. Maybe an hour went by, but I didn't dare move. I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sunlight was shining into the tent, making everything look normal again. My boyfriend was already outside, cooking breakfast over the fire. I sat up quickly, checking around the tent for any sign of what happened last night. There were no footprints, no damage to the tent, nothing. It was like it never happened, like I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew it wasn't just in my head. As I stood up, my body was stiff from staying still for so long. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in there with us. I tried to act normal, but the whole morning felt off. Everything looked fine, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We packed up to leave, and as we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. I glanced back at the campsite through the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A small mark just below the tent. A handprint. Not mine, not my boyfriend's. Someone else's. It was pressed deep into the ground, like they had been kneeling right outside the tent, watching us. And I realized then whoever or whatever it was hadn't left at all. They had been there the whole time, waiting. I decided to camp alone in the mountains like I had done plenty of times before. I always liked being by myself out there. The quiet, the sound of the rain hitting the tent, and the smell of the wet dirt around me. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful trip. Just me, the outdoors, and a storm passing through. The rain started earlier that day, slowly at first, just a light sprinkle, but by afternoon, it had turned into a steady downpour. I set up my tent near a forest, far enough from the cliffs to feel safe, and with a view of the valley below, though the fog made it hard to see. I checked the weather a few times before leaving, and it showed rain but nothing that seemed dangerous. By the time it got dark, the rain was heavy. The trees creaked with the wind, but I wasn't worried. My tent was sturdy, and I set it up on higher ground so it wouldn't flood. I crawled inside, got into my sleeping bag, and listened to the rain. The wind picked up, howling louder, and the rain hit harder, but I kept telling myself it was just normal mountain weather. Then I heard something that didn't belong. It was a thumping sound, not like the rain or wind. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just a branch knocking against a tree. But it kept going, slow and steady. Every few seconds, thud, thud. I sat up and listened more carefully. The sound was getting closer. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too slow, too heavy. Maybe someone else was hiking through the storm, I thought. But that didn't make sense. Who would be out here in this weather this late in such a far-off place? The thumping stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding hard. I heard footsteps now, heavy and slow, moving just outside the thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there. I tried to stay calm, but fear was creeping in fast. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rain hitting the tent. Then something brushed against the side of the tent. It made a low, dragging sound, like someone was running their hand along the fabric. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what it could be. An animal? Person? Whoever or whatever it was, they were close enough to touch the tent. I didn't move. I stayed completely still, trying not to make any noise. The dragging sound went on for a few moments, though it felt much longer. Then, just like that, it stopped. I listened as hard as I could, but there was nothing but the rain again. I waited, too scared to move, wondering if whatever it was would come back. After what felt like forever, I finally grabbed my flashlight and turned it on. The light lit up the tent, casting shadows on the wet fabric. I slowly unzipped the door just enough to peek outside. There was nothing, just rain and darkness. I stayed like that for a while, my flashlight moving over the soaked ground and swaying trees, but I didn't see anything. No signs of anyone or anything. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to explain what I'd heard. I went back inside, but I couldn't sleep. I kept listening, waiting for those footsteps or that scraping sound to come back. But they never did. By morning, the rain had lightened to a drizzle. I packed up as fast as I could and started hiking back down the mountain. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something was watching me. Even now, I can't make sense of what happened. I didn't see anything, but I know I heard it. Something or someone was right there, close enough to touch my tent, and I still can't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just passing by. It was waiting. When I was a kid, my grandparents took me camping deep in the forest. They loved being out there, far from the city noise. My grandfather always said the farther we were from people, the better the camping. This time we found a spot that was really far, miles away from any road. The first day was quiet and calm. We set up the tent, collected some firewood, and looked around the area. The forest felt normal. The trees were tall, the bushes thick, and I could hear birds chirping in the distance. As the sun started going down, the shadows stretched long, and it got cold fast. We started a fire, ate dinner, and then crawled into the tent for the night. I woke up in the middle of the night to a weird sound. It was a thumping noise, like something hitting the ground far away, but loud enough that it caught my attention. I lay still, listening closely, trying to figure out if it was an animal. But it didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was too steady, too much like it was done on purpose. I glanced at my grandparents, but they were asleep, totally unaware. The thumping got louder. It seemed to be coming from all around us, not just one direction. Thump, thump, thump. Each time it sounded closer, like something was moving around our campsite. I stayed frozen, my mind racing, trying to tell myself it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch falling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I finally sat up and looked out of the tent flap. The fire had died down to a few glowing embers, barely lighting the trees. Everything was still, nothing was moving. But that sound, it didn't stop. Kept getting louder, getting closer. I decided to step outside, even though my heart was pounding. The cold air hit me as soon as I unzipped the tent. The noise stopped right then. The sudden silence was even worse. It was like the forest had frozen. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I didn't wake my grandparents. I just stood there, waiting, hoping nothing would happen. Minutes went by, and just when I started to feel like maybe it was over, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't just the thumping. I heard footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, crunching on the leaves. They were coming toward me. My chest tightened as I looked around, trying to see who or what was there. But no matter where I looked, I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps got louder, closer. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. It wasn't just one pair of footsteps now. It sounded like a group of people all walking toward me, but still, I couldn't see a thing. I panicked and rushed back into the tent, zipping it up as fast as I could. The footsteps stopped again, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was thick, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my ears straining to catch any sound, my mind racing with what could be out there. When morning came, everything looked normal. The forest was calm, like nothing had happened. My grandparents acted like it had been just another night in the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us. After breakfast, I walked around the campsite, looking for any signs, footprints, broken branches, anything that could explain what I had heard. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything moving through. We packed up and left later that day, and as we drove back toward the main road, I kept thinking about it. The noise, the footsteps, none of it made sense. I tried telling myself it was all in my head, that I'd been hearing things because we were so far from civilization. But even now, years later, I can still hear those footsteps in my mind. It's like they're following me, getting closer every time I think about them. I never told anyone about that night, not even my grandparents. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I get the feeling that whatever was out there in the woods that night, it's still watching, waiting for the right moment to get even closer. The sun had gone down hours ago, leaving only the flickering light of the campfire against the tall trees around my tent. I was out in the woods for a weekend break, just me and nature, or so I thought. I had set up my campsite near a small stream, far enough from the road that I felt cut off but close enough to the parking lot to feel safe. As I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the night, the rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, I noticed something strange in the shadows. The air felt heavy with an odd tension. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, a soft sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I leaned closer to the fire, trying to tell myself it was just a deer or some other animal. But the sound kept coming, growing louder. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the dark, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Suddenly, I remembered the news stories I had seen before my trip. A string of break-ins at nearby campsites. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reminded myself that I was ready for anything. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal out here. Then the footsteps stopped. My heart began to race. Every noise felt magnified. I decided to check my gear, hoping it would take my mind off things. As I searched through my backpack, I heard a rustle behind me. I turned quickly, shining the flashlight over the trees. Nothing was there. I was alone. Just as I started to relax, I saw a shadow moving just outside the firelight. My heart sank. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I focused the light more carefully. I could see a figure crouching low among the trees, watching me. Panic surged inside me. I grabbed my knife, my only means of protection. The figure shifted, and I could make out a man, dirty and scruffy, clearly not someone who belonged in this camping crowd. He was dressed in dark clothes, and his eyes glinted in the firelight. My mind raced with thoughts of what he could want. I knew I had to act fast. I turned and ran toward my car, parked a few hundred yards away. The sound of leaves crunching under my feet felt like thunder, and I could hear the man moving behind me, the sound getting closer. I reached the clearing where my car was parked and fumbled for my keys. They slipped from my fingers and fell to the ground with a loud clatter. Just then, I heard him breaking through the brush, and fear took hold of me. I quickly bent down, grabbed the keys, and jumped into the car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, praying it would roar to life. It did. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man stood there, watching, his face dark and unreadable. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my heart still racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I called the police and told them everything. The next morning, they informed me they had been searching for a group of criminals who had been targeting campers in the area. They warned me to stay alert and report anything strange. I drove home shaken but relieved, knowing that I had escaped that terrifying night. But even as I settled back into my routine, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I went for a walk in the woods or sat in my backyard, I felt eyes on me, hidden in the shadows. It haunted me. I kept wondering about that man. Who was he? What did he want? And then, weeks later, while scrolling through the news, I came across a story about a man who had been arrested for a series of break-ins in various campsites. There was a photo of him. It was the same man I had seen that night. My blood ran cold as I realized he could have easily found me, could have come into my tent while I slept. I never went back to those woods. The fear of being watched stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. I learned to respect the woods, knowing that not everyone who steps into them has good intentions. And late at night, when the wind rustles the leaves and the darkness closes in, I still feel that chill creeping down my spine. Sometimes, I think I can hear footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be safe again. It was a hot summer weekend, and I decided to go camping in the woods behind my house. I liked the peace and quiet of nature, but I knew my neighbors, Dave and Linda, were camping a few sites away. They were friendly enough, but there was always something a little strange about them. As I set up my tent, I noticed that Dave seemed off. He kept looking over at me, and Linda was unusually quiet, almost jumpy. I brushed it off, thinking they were just trying to enjoy their own space. The sun sank behind the trees, turning the sky a deep orange and pink. I built a small fire to cook dinner and unwind. Later, as night fell, I heard noises that got my attention. There was rustling in the bushes near my tent. I figured it might be a deer or a raccoon, but then I heard something else. A low growl that made my skin crawl. I sat up, trying to see into the dark, but all I could see was black. The crackling of the fire did nothing to calm my growing fear. Suddenly, I saw a shadow dash between the trees, just outside the reach of the firelight. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight, thinking it might help me feel better. But as I pointed it into the darkness, the light flickered and died. Panic flooded through me. The rustling started again, now much closer. I decided to peek outside my tent, hoping it was just an animal. As I unzipped the flap, I saw the flickering lights from Dave and Linda's campsite. They were moving quickly around their tent, almost like they were trying to hide from something. The growling grew louder, and I could see a big figure moving toward them. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I stepped out into the chilly night air, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to stay quiet as I walked toward their campsite, wanting to know what was happening. As I got closer, I realized the figure was a large dog, wild and snarling. Dave and Linda were struggling to control it. The dog had broken free from their tent, and they were frantic, trying to pull it back. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I shouted, raising my arms to look bigger, hoping to scare the dog away. The dog hesitated, confused by my presence. That brief moment was all I needed. I rushed forward and grabbed the nearest stick, waving it in front of me. The dog growled but then backed off slightly. Just then, Dave and Linda managed to get a leash on it just as I arrived. Breathing hard, I helped them secure the dog back in their tent. The tension eased a bit, but I could still feel the fear hanging in the air. Dave thanked me for my help, and I saw the worry in his eyes. They explained that their dog was always aggressive when startled, and they never expected it to break free at night. We sat quietly around the fire, trying to shake off the scary moment. As I lay in my tent later, listening to the sounds of the night, I felt grateful I had been there. But something still didn't feel right. The rustling in the bushes returned, and my thoughts raced. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The growling had stopped, but in the stillness of the night, I could hear the faint crunch of leaves outside my tent. My heart raced again. It was too quiet now. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a scream, high-pitched and filled with terror. It was Linda's voice, piercing through the night. My body went cold. I scrambled out of my tent, the cool air hitting my skin like ice. Dave was shouting, frantically looking around, but I didn't see the dog anywhere. I stepped into the darkness, fear gripping me. The fire cast long shadows, and I could see Dave stumbling backward, his face pale. He pointed toward the trees. I followed his gaze, and there, in the dim light, I saw something moving, something large and dark, blending into the night. Then I realized it wasn't just the dog we needed to worry about. Whatever was lurking out there was far worse. I felt the weight of dread settle in my stomach as I understood we weren't alone in these woods. The night closed in around me, and the silence was deafening. In that moment, as the shadows shifted and the air grew heavy with fear, I knew that camping in the woods was no longer a peaceful escape. We had stumbled into something far more dangerous, and as I turned to Dave, I saw it in his eyes, the same chilling realization. Whatever was out there was watching, waiting, and I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't be long before it came for us. We had been in the woods for 2 days, camping as part of a training exercise. I was in a small group led by my commander, a tough guy known for being serious. We set up camp deep in the forest, away from the usual paths, to practice finding our way and surviving in the wild. When night fell, the forest filled with sounds. The leaves rustled, an owl hooted far away, and our campfire crackled softly. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire and the sense of togetherness around it, but something felt wrong. There was an unsettling quietness between the noises, a feeling like someone or something was watching us from the shadows. Later, I lay in my tent, the thin fabric barely blocking the cool night air. Sleep came slowly. I kept hearing twigs snapping outside, making my heart race. Each noise felt too loud in the stillness, and I was convinced I wasn't alone. Just as I started to drift off, a loud crash echoed through the woods. It was close, way too close. I sat up fast, listening hard. The others in our group were already on edge, but no one said anything. I unzipped my tent quietly and peeked outside. The fire was dim, just glowing embers now, and shadows danced among the trees. I could see my commander standing tense and still, searching the darkness. Suddenly, I saw something move, a figure darting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Was it just an animal, or something much worse? I quickly ducked back into the tent, trying to calm my racing heart. Minutes felt like hours. The forest was eerily quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. My gut told me to stay where I was, but I couldn't fight the urge to find out what was happening. I took a deep breath and unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside again. What I saw made my stomach drop. The figure was standing there, not moving, just staring at our camp. My instincts screamed at me to get back inside, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was tall and thin, blending into the trees but clearly human. The longer I stared, the more I felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity battling inside me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished deeper into the woods. My commander finally noticed the disturbance. He moved cautiously, signaling for the rest of us to be quiet and alert. The air felt heavy with tension, like we were waiting for something terrible to happen. As dawn broke, we decided to pack up and leave. The fear from the night still lingered in our minds, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us closely, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My commander's face looked serious as he led us back to the main trail. The forest felt different in the daylight, less frightening, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. I thought of the figure lurking in the shadows, wondering if it was still out there, following us. The woods held dark secrets, and even though we made it back without any major problems, I knew this experience would haunt my thoughts for a long time. We finally reached our vehicles, the weight of the night lifting as we stepped into the bright morning sun. But as I looked back at the thick trees, a shiver ran down my spine. Whatever had watched us was still out there, waiting, hidden among the shadows. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I felt it deep in my bones that we had not seen the last of it. The forest, once a place of adventure, now felt like a trap, holding something that wanted to be found but didn't want to be seen. I knew I would never look at the woods the same way again. The thought of it watching, lurking just out of sight, would stay with me long after we left, like a cold grip around my heart.